Join us from the waiting room. There's a prompt in the chat to let us know where you're logging in from and a word to describe the attitude you'd hope to bring and when you had an opportunity to listen to somebody with a different lived experience than your own. Welcome back, everyone who's here again from session 1, and welcome to those joining us for the first time. We're so glad that you're here. I'm Jane Field, and I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Council of Churches. We're an ecumenical partnership of 7 mainline Protestant denominations whose roots are in Hebrew and Christian scriptures. That includes Episcopalians, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Quakers, Unitarian Universalists, the United Church of Christ, and United Methodists. Those 7 member denominations have 437 churches in our state with about 55,000 members. So we're admitting a few more folks in from the waiting room as they join us. I'd like to share with you that the Council's mission is to inspire congregations and individuals to unite in building a culture of justice, compassion, and peace, where the full humanity and dignity of every person and the sacredness of all creation are affirmed and protected. One of the ways we fulfill that mission is by offering this biennial faith-based advocacy event to equip and empower people to speak with the voice of faith to those who are entrusted with governing and the creation of good public policy. We'll begin tonight's program in a moment with a brief time of centering and prayer, but first I'd like to thank the members of the planning committee from the Maine Council of Churches who've worked so hard to put this series on. We have 5 members from our board of directors: Evelyn Johnson Moore, who's also the co-chair of our public policy committee; Carolyn Lambert, the vice president of our board; Alan Ewing Merrill, Marge Kilkelly, and Mike Seavey. Joining these board members has been Izzy Ostrowski from our trusted partner, Preble Street Faith Advocacy Network, and running our registration, our platform, our database, all the communications. And tonight, helping out with tech is our office administrator, Megan Akers. So thanks to all those folks. Now, on to tonight's session, part 2 of this year's 4-part online series. You'll hear more later about sessions 3 and 4. Those are coming up on April 6th and 27th. But in tonight's session, we'll spend the first half of our time all together, expanding our understanding of how important it is to center the voices and experiences of those directly impacted by systemic racism, homelessness, poverty, and hunger when we advocate for and craft effective legislation, as bills are being drafted and considered in committee, and not waiting until bills become law to do that important work. After those conversations, we're going to be sending you into breakout sessions for Public Policy 101 and Public Policy 201. If you didn't have a chance to sign up in advance, Megan will send you a private chat message to determine which group you'd like to be placed into. 101 is for folks that are just beginning the advocacy journey and would like an overview and some basic skills. And 201 is for those with some advocacy experience who'd like to do a deeper dive and get some strategies and advanced skills to become more effective. Now I'd like to thank Reverend Sarah Ewing Merrill, who has designed and will lead tonight's time for centering and prayer. And in order to create a still space for connecting with God, I'll ask everyone, except for the worship leaders, to please be sure their microphones are muted. That means there should be a red line going through the microphone icon on your screen. And with that, Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jane. I'm glad to be with you all again for this online faith-based advocacy series. And tonight's worship, all of the words, including our scriptural interpretation, are authored by Cole Arthur Riley, who is the author of Black Liturgies, both on Instagram and Patreon, and encourage you to check her out if you aren't familiar with Black Liturgies. So first, let's hear these words from scripture from the book of Jeremiah in the 31st chapter. Hear these words. Behold, I will gather my people from the farthest parts of the earth, those who are blind, those who cannot walk, the pregnant woman, and she who is in labor, all who have been pushed to the margins. Together, a great company, they shall return to where they belong. They may come weeping, but I will lead along brooks of water and make sure the path is safe and restful. I will be a parent to them and remind them that they are my children and I have not forgotten them.
Let us pray. God of the margins, thank you for being a God who goes to the far ends of our societies to find your people. We confess that we have become numb to the dignity of particular people groups. There are those of us who have known what it is to have status revoked or diminished, to endure the trauma of ableism, to know alienation more than belonging.
Help us pay attention to the voices that are pushed to the margins when we center the white pseudo-savior in our conversations of justice. We confess that we elevate white conservative men and women for simply being human and neglect the oppressed that have given their very lives to affirm their own dignity.
God, change this. Form us into people capable of acknowledging a good work without constructing heroes of people to satiate guilt and defend integrity. Let us trace words back to their source, listening to those whose throats are raw with years of demanding justice and protecting dignity.
Remind us what courage looks like, and as we incline our ears to the neglected, let us become more human. God, give us ears to hear. Amen.
Amen. And as we end this time of centering, we invite you to hear this song, and as you learn it, to sing along, because it does repeat. We shall be known by the company we keep.
We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the world. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the world. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within the earth. It is time now, it is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the well. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love.
Thank you, Sarah, and your worship team. I love how many voices you've woven in, and the song was absolutely beautiful. Perfect way to prepare our hearts and our minds and our spirits for this evening's work. Thank you. I'd like to introduce to all of you our first guest for this evening. It's Reverend Kenneth Lewis, who I think is probably known to a whole lot of you. He is the pastor of Green Memorial AME Zion Church here in Portland, where he has served for the past 18 years. And in June, he was appointed by the governor to serve on the state's permanent commission on the status of racial and indigenous and Maine's tribal populations, where he serves as a representative of faith communities. Reverend Lewis, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Jane, it's so good to be with you, and so good to have that centering moment in that prayer. I look forward to our conversation, and so hello to the 61 participants who are engaged today.
Thanks. So as you know, Reverend Lewis, we're here tonight to equip all these folks you just said hi to do faith-based advocacy for justice as effectively as possible and as consistently with the moral agenda that we find in Hebrew and Christian scripture. But before they all get down into the weeds of how bills are written or how the state's legislative committees work or how appropriations are made, we felt that it was absolutely imperative to lay some groundwork and to say that before anything else, people of faith are called by God to do justice and love with steadfastness and walk with humility, loving God and their neighbor as their self. And we really think that to do that, we've got to take a specific approach to the way in which voices of color and voices of the marginalized are heard and respected and centered, and the way in which the experiences of our siblings of color and siblings who are unhoused and poor and hungry become central to this policy process we have. And I know you know that in a few minutes, our esteemed colleague, Joby Thoyleal from Maine Equal Justice is going to bring us up to speed on the work of that permanent commission. But first, you and I have been given some space to do a little God talk.
All right.
All right. And I heard that you preached a sermon a few weeks ago called Take Heed How You Hear. And maybe that's a place you'd like to start this conversation.
Sure. So I shared with you, my daughter Chanel did a TEDx talk called Radical Listening some time ago. And this whole idea, if we're going to do this work with conviction and effectiveness, we need to take heed how we hear one another. Not just the functioning of our ears, but what happens in our heads and in our hearts. In this day and age that we live in, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of nuisance, and there's a lot of nuance all around us that's bombarding us. And the stimuli is just overwhelming. And I think it's important for those of us who are seeking justice and loving mercy and seeking to walk humbly, because that takes effort to walk humbly. We really have to learn how to listen, take heed to how we hear the cries and the calls for justice from those whose voices have been silenced and those who feel they have no voice. And I make the distinction between those who feel they have no voice and those who have been talking but no one's been listening.
That's a good distinction. That's important to say. So I'm wondering what you might name as some of the most common obstacles that white folks or overprivileged folks, those two things are sometimes the same thing, or legislators, what are the obstacles we've got to overcome in our efforts to do that active, transformative listening when we are trying to listen to people of color and do it well? What have you seen?
Yeah, beyond setting aside kind of the privilege and the unconscious bias, is I think to recognize and acknowledge that your lens might be different, your experience is different. And I think I put in the chat respectful. I think we have to approach these conversations and discussions and interactions with a level of respect for one's truth, one's experience. So I'm from Boston, and I have a Boston experience. I will probably never be a Mainer. I've been here for 18 years, but I won't be a Mainer. But I carry all of my 60s and 70s Boston experience, life experience, wherever I go. And it doesn't leave me, but it gives me context for what I see and what I experience in a new place, right? And I think it's important to hear those experiences respectfully and openly, with openness, when we begin to frame our language and our engagement, when we want to advocate for folks who may not have been able to advocate for themselves. How do we maintain the authenticity of the cry, of the call, when we don't necessarily approach it with an openness? I think that's the first thing, is that the conversations, the discussions, the learning, because we learn from one another, it really has to be reciprocal, but it has to be respectful. There has to be honesty there and authenticity. So the pain, the disenfranchisement, I can't just, pull up my boots and my bootstraps around that. If you want to engage me, you have to engage me where I am and respect where I am, and also take the time to hear where I am. I may not be in such a rush to get to where you want to go.
Well said.
Yeah, so
That's well said. And I know you and I were chatting the other day, and you had lifted up the common refrain so often heard, but I'm a good person.
but I'm a good person, yeah.
But I'm a good person. I had good intentions. And that's not enough, is it?
Well, I think a good person, good intention, that's cool. But I want good trouble, right? I want good action. I want consistency. And I think that's the fits and starts. Do we need another national crisis? In my mind, we've been in a national crisis since we've been a nation.
Yep.
And actually pre-nation.
Before that, right.
Before that, right? So, and when I continue to see, the strategies post Bacon's rebellion brought up over and over again to keep us separate and to cloud our ability to understand one another, because if a BIPOC person gains, that doesn't mean someone else loses. And I think that's an important message to share, especially from a faith perspective. you and I, if we're talking about God talk, we were talking a little bit about the Exodus, and we were talking a little bit about Moses going to the authorities saying, let my people go. We want some justice here, right?
Right.
But when the Exodus occurred, it wasn't just our Jewish brothers and sisters who left Egypt. Whoever was willing to go, whoever was willing to sign up for what was new went as well.
Mm.
And so to think about how important and how powerful it is when we can come together under a banner of faith, love, and charity, right? If we can come under that banner seeking that justice and that beloved community, I think we have the opportunity to, whether it's legislation, we have the moral imperative to make change.
Yes, well, that's right. We would agree with you here at the Maine Council of Churches. That's put better than I could. And I know that you all work on the Permanent Commission and that you worked very hard over last summer looking at what happens even with the best of intentions. We're not saying that every bill was written with the express purpose of being discriminatory or having a negative, harmful impact on our communities of color. And yet, when you all got together and looked through the bills from the last session, it was clear that racial impact is something that really needs to be considered from the ground up, not after the bills have gotten written and in front of everyone.
Absolutely, and I'm excited that LD2
Yes.
in both houses was voted up, and now we just need to wait for it to go through its final processes. Joby could speak to this extremely well, but it's important for these racial impact studies to go forward in our legislation, because over the course of history, we have legislated, passed laws that have exacerbated the issues. And while some may have had good intention, I can't help but to think about all of the voter suppression activities that are taking place in other parts of the country. That's legislation. And if you look
with a racial impact.
the legislative history, disenfranchisement was passed into law.
Yes.
And so, I think that when those bills come forward, they come forward with a fiscal note, they should also come forward with a note on racial equity. And so we proposed and promoted using a lens. And hopefully, as the legislature moves forward, they'll apply that according to LD2.
And you mentioned our friend Joby. I think this is a good time to bring him into the conversation. Joby Thoyle from our partner organization, Maine Equal Justice. I finally stopped calling them Maine Equal Justice Partners. That you can't teach an old dog new tricks. It took me forever to learn to do that. But Joby's going to join us now to talk about the role and work of the commission. He's a senior policy advocate at MAJ and a member of the Permanent Commission, as well as a member of our Public Policy Committee. And Joby holds a degree from New York University School for Public Service. So welcome, Joby. We're so glad you could be with us. And we're hoping in just a couple of minutes you could tell the group more about what the Permanent Commission is, what its work has been, and talk a little bit about that report you issued in September, which I know you had a big part in producing.
Yeah, thank you, Jane, and thank you, Reverend Lewis. The Permanent Commission, it is an honor to serve on the commission. Along with Reverend Lewis, I've met the Reverend before, briefly before the work of the commission, but we've now had a lot of meetings together, and it's been a really valuable experience. And I look forward to the work we do going forward, because there's only so much more to do. And let's just get into the potential of this commission. So the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Maine Tribal Populations, it was established through legislation in 2019. Representative Rachel Talbot Ross, who I'm sure many people in this meeting are familiar with, She's a representative from Portland. She's now the assistant majority leader in the Maine House of Representatives. In 2019, she proposed this bill and to establish this commission. And the commission is, in generally speaking, its mission is to examine racial disparities across systems in Maine and to promote solutions to improving the outcomes and opportunities for Maine's historically disadvantaged racial, indigenous, and tribal populations. And the argument made for the bill was in 2019 before the events of 2020, but the argument was clear even then, just maybe not as many people were thinking about these things. But if you just looked at the lived experience of people of color in Maine telling you about their experience, but then also looked at the data, you could see that there are disparities across our systems: education system, criminal justice, wealth and income, employment. It runs a gamut. I'm sure many of you have heard about a lot of these things around the country. I'm sorry to say, I know Maine's exceptional, but it's not exceptional in this regard. All the same disparities you see in other parts of the country are borne out in the data here in Maine. And so that's why the commission was established. It was established as an independent government entity. All of us on the commission, we are appointed by either the governor or the Senate of the president of the Maine Senate, or the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, excuse me. But that's it. Beyond that, our commission is independent, and we are empowered to, we're required to do certain things. We're required to conduct research, hold at least one public hearing every year, produce a report on our findings. But we're also empowered to do a lot. We can advise all three branches of government. We can do public education. We can submit legislation. So the commission itself and the powers it has, it has a lot of potential to help. There's something that was said so far. I think Reverend Lewis said it. It's when you think about the strategies in place to keep people separate and not working together, to keep them from understanding each other. Well, ultimately, the Permanent Commission is a vehicle to help us better understand each other. Because if we can do research, collect public input, and help disseminate that input in the form of public education, in the form of advisement to three branches of government, in the form of legislation, then we are helping increase the understanding of the experiences of other people in our state.
And I understand that you're not funded or staffed at this point. So that is a critical need moving forward. And folks like the ones on our call tonight could be perhaps assisting in efforts to get the funding and staffing you need to do that work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, so
I'll jump on that too, but go ahead, Jovi.
no, please.
I think,
Oh, no.
The governor allocated $50,000 to kind of get us started. But the thing that folks may not know is that the commission is able to receive outside donation, not just through the legislature. There is a bill, I don't know the number, Joby does, that seeks funding for the Permanent Commission from the Appropriations Committee to do the work. This commission has been working, unlike others, every 2 weeks, more than once a month, gathering and trying to understand the opportunity that's presented before us. And so I think it's important for us to understand that we have the ability to receive external funding. And we need external funding to have the kind of staff to do the research, to do the policy related work. Everyone on the commission is appointed as a volunteer, and we don't have any staff, and it's important that we do.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you for being volunteers. This is service to our state. It's service to every one of us in this room tonight, and service to the communities of color who suffer those disparities you just described. And in addition to those thanks, thank you for joining us tonight. Your presence here has made a big difference. And I think it will make us better advocates for racial equity and inclusion here in Maine. So thank you
for having me.
Thank you for the work you do.
Thank you for having us.
So an
Thank you for what you're
example,
doing.
good night. It's good to see you guys. I'm so grateful to you. And I'm going to turn now and introduce another voice who educated me just the other day. She told me an example of the kind of racial disparities you just heard described by Joby and Reverend Lewis is the disproportionate number of Mainers of color who are experiencing homelessness here in our state. According to the most recent data from Maine's official point in time count, 26% of unhoused neighbors of ours here in Maine are Black or African American, but Black people only make up 1.5% of our whole population, 26% of our homeless population, 1.5% overall. For people of color and for white folks alike, homelessness is a profoundly traumatic experience that creates overwhelming challenges to securing what you need to get stability again. Things like employment, housing, good health, good mental health, access to education, the ability to accumulate wealth, all of these things. And our next guest looked me in the eye just the other day and said, "You cannot understand homelessness until you've actually experienced it." Carolyn Silvius is joining us from Homeless Voices for Justice, and she has experienced homelessness, and she's graciously agreed to share her wisdom with us tonight in the hope that by doing so, she'll help equip us to do better and to be better, more effective in our advocacy, and to be advocates who really understand how essential it is to center these voices of those who got the lived experience, and to be sure they have a seat at the policy-making table. Now, as you meet Carolyn, keep in mind, as we said at the outset, she not only works for Homeless Voices for Justice, she works with the Maine chapter of the Poor People's Campaign, she works with Maine People's Alliance, and with the Legislative Committee of the Green Party. So welcome, Carolyn. Thank you for being here with us tonight. And I will start off by asking you a question just to get our conversation started. Since people can't fully understand the experience of homelessness unless they've lived it, why would you say that means people with the lived experience should be involved in legislative and policy decision-making? And what have you seen happen when they're not involved? What have you seen when their voices are not heard and respected and centered?
Thank you for having me tonight. First of all, I appreciate this opportunity to give you some idea of what it's like to be homeless. Although, like I said to you, you can never fully understand homelessness until you have lived it. It is such an enveloping experience. It changes not only your life, but you yourself. And that's pretty bad, especially when you become homeless and you're older. I mean, you've lived 69 years, 70 years in one state of affairs, and now all of a sudden you have changed. You have become a different person because of that experience. The trauma associated with homelessness is overwhelming. How many people do you see that identify themselves? Oh, I live in the West End or whatever. Okay. Your home is part of your very personality. You identify that way. When suddenly you do not have a home, you have lost part of your identity, your personal identity. That is very traumatic. Homelessness causes a form of post-traumatic stress syndrome. You don't get over it once you're housed. That's not the end. It's actually just the beginning, because you have to learn to live with the new person that you are now. You asked me a question, what happens when people don't listen And
Right.
and I appreciated the comments that the Reverend made about how people should listen. That they have to listen with humility, and that they have to listen with understanding and with love.
Mm.
And that is very, very true. When little example, I work better with examples than
Yep.
I do by trying to talk. Um, Example: the city council this year had hearings, public hearings on centering the shelter, or on where to build the new proposed shelter.
Mhm.
80 citizens from all over the city got up to speak. I counted. There were 80. It was a long public hearing, and 80 people stood up. Not one of those 80 people said that Riverton was a good place to build a shelter.
Hmm.
The city council 2 days later voted to put the new shelter in Riverton. They did not listen. As a result of that decision, people are going to be unable to access the thing that they most need, the shelter, to get them through their homeless period and into permanent housing. Because that's what part of what shelters do, is it helps people find their way out of homelessness through work programs, through housing programs, through programs that address the issues that they've already had or have developed since they've been homeless. I mean, homelessness is painful, very painful. And many of the homeless end up healing that pain, or disguising that pain with drugs, alcohol, or become mentally ill.
Mhm.
That is the way they deal with the pain of homelessness. So these issues, mental illness and drug use do not cause homelessness. Very often, homelessness causes those problems. Okay.
That's well said, Carolyn. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's it's very backward from the way a lot of people believe.
Yeah.
I've heard too many people say, "Oh, that person is homeless because they use drugs." No, that's not the case. In many, many cases, that person uses drugs because they were homeless or are homeless.
And the stories that you've shared from your own observations, and you're a seasoned advocate. You've been up in Augusta more than probably any of us. You testify, you know the system, and you've seen time and time again that people in those positions of power, and even people in positions like those of us who are faith-based advocates, assume we know what they need. They being the homeless people, and that's a trap, isn't it? If we assume what we think you need without ever asking.
And that is very, very true. Your words were never spoken. You cannot know what we need until you've heard us, and really heard us. I don't mean just heard the words. I mean heard us, heard our emotions and our pain. You know.
Mm-hmm.
And to hear us, you have to hear us with love.
And that's what faith-based advocates should have a skill set to do, my friends, is to listen with love and respect, and offering dignity to people that everything in their circumstances are working to strip them of that dignity. Carolyn, we were talking, I remember a couple days ago, and your cat Fluffernutter walked behind you. And I said, you know, what a pretty cat. And you explained, well, guess what happens when you experience homelessness? You lose your pets. You have to find someone who will care for them, or they go to a shelter. That every aspect of life, and if you haven't lived it, you can't imagine all of the ways in which that happens. Your witness, Carolyn, is powerful. You have an impact on the people that you tell those kinds of stories to. You've had an impact on me, and I think you've had an impact on everyone listening to you here tonight, as well as to the legislators you've spoken to. Some of you may know Carolyn even ran for office. And can you imagine the different kind of policy making that would happen if those tables where those decisions are made included people with that lived world experience? It would
Which is
look,
exactly why I ran.
yeah, exactly.
Because very few legislators have experienced homelessness. So very few can know from personal experience, can truly understand what it means to be homeless.
Mm,
If you had a few legislatures that had experienced it, I think you would find a very, very different set of laws being made.
I think you're
And
right.
as far as testifying, I'm testifying before the legislature 3 times this week alone.
Wow.
I'm worried they're going to start. Oh no, there she is again.
We
But
are grateful, and we're in your debt that you have the courage and the generosity of spirit to do that work, because many of us in this room tonight don't have the wisdom you do. So we offer you our thanks and our gratitude for who you are and what you do,
thank
and
you.
for sharing it with us here tonight. Thank you. And I think you've done a good job of preparing folks to go to their breakout rooms now. I joked with Carolyn the other day that she could have led these breakout rooms. She knows the legislative process up one side and down the other. But we've imposed upon you enough tonight, my dear. You go and take Fluffernutter and give him a hug for us, and know how grateful we are to you for being with us this evening. And I know I speak for all of you in thanking you. And I see in the chat, folks are thanking you as well, Carolyn. So thanks for being with us. And now the time has...
I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, you bet. You bet. It was a privilege to have you here. So we've reached the point now, folks, where we're going to send you into your breakout sessions, Public Policy 101 and Public Policy 201. Many, many thanks to Kate Brennan and Umbreen Rana of Maine Equal Justice, who will be assisted by theologians from the Maine Council of Churches Board, Marge Kilkelly, and our co-chair of public policy, John Hennessy, to whom we also extend our heartfelt thanks. So I think Megan's been busy behind the scenes, making sure you all are signed up, and you'll have 35 minutes in your small group. Once you are 1 minute out from being done, you're going to see a little countdown clock begin. Do not panic and leave your room. You don't need to leave. It will just bring you back to us when that 1 minute is up. And that 1 minute will be a chance for your leaders to wrap up the work they've done with you tonight. So with that, I'll invite Megan to open the rooms. You should see an invitation pop up on your screen, which you can accept to join a room. And we'll see you back here in 35 minutes. And as folks are leaving to go to their small groups, for those of you watching a recording of this meeting, I want to let you know that at this point, the recording will come to an end because we aren't able to record those breakout sessions. But we thank you for joining us tonight, or for joining us by watching a recording of tonight, and hope that you'll be back for sessions 3 and 4 on April 6th and 27th. So with that, I'll end the recording for tonight.